Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You know me, I love a good page turner. And, well, let me tell you this book, How America Lost Its Mind. It's really got me thinking.
Oh, yeah. What is it about this one that's grabbed you?
Well, from the excerpts you sent over, it seems like the author Thomas Patterson is saying that America is facing this crisis of reason and trust.
Right, and that this is impacting our ability to govern effectively.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I find so interesting about this? It's not just about disagreeing on policy like tax plans or healthcare. It's deeper than that. We're at a point where we can't even agree on the same reality.
Okay, so give me an example then. What kind of different realities are we talking about?
Well, he cites some alarming statistics. A third of Americans believe climate change is a hoax. Another significant portion believes in a deep state controlling everything from the shadows. And these aren't fringe theories anymore. They're becoming mainstream.
Wow. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around that. But I see what you mean about agreeing on reality. If you can't even agree on basic facts, how do you even begin to solve problems?
And that's what makes it so difficult to address any of the very real issues facing us. I mean, this goes way beyond just having different opinions. We're seeing a crisis of trust in the institutions that hold our society together. Record low levels of confidence in the government, the media, each other. It's a huge problem.
Yeah, it's like we're stuck. The less we trust, the harder it is to solve problems, and then we trust even less. So where do we even begin to break free from that?
Well, Patterson points to tribalism as a major culprit. We've become so fiercely loyal to our political parties that it's often more important than actual policy positions.
Yeah, you know what? That reminds me of something that really stuck with me from the book. He talks about a poll where people couldn't name a single positive trait about the opposing political party. Not one. It's like we're so busy focusing on what divides us that we've completely lost sight of any common ground.
And this isn't just some harmless rivalry either. This is what we call negative partisanship. And it's got a real chokehold on our political system. It's fueled by changes in how the parties themselves are structured, how we consume media. All these factors come together to create a climate where compromise feels impossible.
So it's like we're almost hardwired to just reject anything the other side supports, even if it's something we might actually agree with on its own.
You got it. It's almost like the policy positions themselves are becoming less important than just blindly aligning with your tribe. And that's a worrying trend for any functioning democracy, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it's not just about our own personal beliefs either. The media plays a huge role in all of this too. And Patterson really digs into how the media landscape has evolved and how that's impacting our political discourse. What do you think?
You're hitting on another key point. And it's important to clarify that he isn't trying to romanticize some bygone era of perfect journalism. He acknowledges that there's never been a perfect, unbiased media. What he's saying is that the shift towards entertainment outrage and focusing solely on the horse race aspect of politics that has come at the expense of actual substantive reporting.
So it's less about informing the public and more about keeping us glued to our screens regardless of the content.
Yeah, you could say that. And this constant need for the next shocking headline or the most outrageous soundbite, it creates a distorted reality where conflict is more valuable than nuanced discussion.
Yeah, it's like we're living in this echo chamber of extremes where the loudest voices drown out everything else. And speaking of loud voices, Patterson seems particularly concerned about the role of talk radio in all of this.
He is, and for good reason. You see, with conservative talk radio in particular, it's become this breeding ground for misinformation and outrage. And these hosts aren't just presenting different opinions or, having calm discussions. They're actively demonizing anyone who disagrees with them.
So you're saying this goes beyond just having strong opinions. These talk radio shows are actually shaping how people view the world.
Exactly, and there's research to back this up. Studies have shown that exposure to this kind of hyper-partisan media can actually make people more extreme in their views and less likely to trust anyone outside their own little bubble.
So it's not just harmless entertainment then. It's actually making our political divide even worse.
That's right. And what's even more concerning is that this kind of rhetoric, it's not limited to just talk radio. It's seeped into other forms of media as well. Certain cable news channels, political blogs, even late-night comedy shows, they all contribute to this climate of outrage and division.
So where does that leave us? Is there any hope for a more reasoned public discourse in this kind of environment? Does Patterson offer any solutions?
Well, he doesn't sugarcoat the challenges, but he does believe there's a way forward. For Patterson, the solution starts with a return to reasoned debate, a renewed emphasis on media literacy, and a willingness to engage with different perspectives, even those that make us uncomfortable.
Okay, but those all sound great in theory, but how do we actually put them into practice? especially in a world where we're just bombarded with information from all sides?
Well, one concrete step Patterson advocates for is electoral reform. Specifically, he's a big proponent of open primaries.
Open primaries. Can you just remind me how those work again?
Sure. So in an open primary system, you don't have to be registered with a specific party to vote in that party's primary. So that means independent voters, and even those registered with the opposing party, can have a say in who makes it onto the general election ballot.
So the idea is that this would encourage candidates to appeal to a broader range of voters, not just the extremes of their own party.
Exactly. If a candidate knows they need to win over moderates and independents to secure the nomination, they're less likely to rely on divisive rhetoric or extreme positions, to appeal to those voters.
That makes sense. But even with electoral reform, we still have to contend with this flood of misinformation and the echo chambers we've created for ourselves.
Absolutely. And that's where media literacy comes in. Patterson argues that we need to be more critical consumers of information, especially online. It's not enough to just read headlines or share something because it confirms what we already believe. We need to ask ourselves who's behind the information, what their agenda might be, and whether other sources are reporting the same thing.
It's like we need to become our own fact checkers in a way.
Yeah,
But that takes time and effort, and let's face it, not everyone is willing to put in the work.
that's true. And it's a real challenge, but even small steps in the right direction can make a difference. What if instead of immediately sharing that shocking article, you take a minute to see if it's been verified by a reputable news organization? Or if you find yourself consistently getting your news from sources that all share the same slant, challenge yourself to seek out a different perspective.
Those are actually really practical tips.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to a larger point that Patterson makes, which is that we all have a role to play in fostering a more reasoned and informed public discourse.
Absolutely. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of such overwhelming challenges. But even small individual actions can have a ripple effect.
I love that. So before we move on to some of the other solutions Patterson proposes, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, this idea that we're hardwired to seek out information that confirms our existing biases. What can we do about that? Is it even possible to overcome our own inherent biases?
That's a great question. And it's something that cognitive scientists and psychologists have been grappling with for years. The good news is that while we may be wired for confirmation bias, we're not slaves to it. There are things we can do to become more aware of our biases and make more objective decisions.
Okay, I'm listening. Give me the inside scoop on how we can rewire our brains.
Well, one powerful technique is simply to be more conscious of the information we're consuming and the sources we're relying on. Are we getting our news from a variety of perspectives, or are we stuck in an echo chamber?
That makes sense. It's like diversifying your media diet.
Exactly. Just like we need a balanced diet for our physical health, we need a balanced diet of information for our mental and civic health.
I like that analogy. So instead of just reading articles or watching news programs that reinforce our existing beliefs, we should actively seek out opposing viewpoints.
You got it. And not just seek them out, but really try to engage with them in a thoughtful and respectful way. That means listening to understand, not just listening to respond.
It's about having those tough conversations even when they make us uncomfortable.
Exactly. And that's where empathy comes in. If we can try to see the world from another person's perspective, even if we don't agree with them, it can help us break free from our own biases and engage in a more constructive dialogue.
So it's about more than just facts and figures. It's about understanding where other people are coming from and why they hold the beliefs they do.
Precisely. And that's where I think Patterson's book really shines. He doesn't just offer a dry analysis of the problem, he challenges us to approach these issues with empathy and a willingness to understand different perspectives.
Which, let's be honest, can be really hard, especially in the heat of a political debate.
It definitely takes effort, but it's essential if we want to bridge the divides that are tearing our country apart. And remember, we're not just talking about politics here. This applies to all aspects of our lives, our relationships, our workplaces, our communities.
You're right. It's about learning to have more productive and respectful conversations, even when we disagree. But let's get back to the political realm for a moment. Patterson also talks about this idea of asymmetric misinformation, which suggests that the problem of misinformation isn't equally distributed across the political spectrum.
That's right. Patterson argues that in recent years, misinformation has been more prevalent among conservatives.
Okay, that's a pretty bold claim. I can already imagine some people getting fired up about that. But what's his reasoning?
Well, he points to a number of factors. For example, he cites the influence of conservative talk radio, which we've already discussed, as well as the rise of certain online platforms that have become breeding grounds for conspiracy theories and disinformation.
So it's not that liberals are immune to misinformation, but that there's been a more concentrated effort to spread it among conservatives.
That's essentially what Patterson argues, and he backs up his claims with a lot of data and research. He's not just making this up, he's drawing on a wealth of evidence to support his arguments.
That's an important distinction. And it's what makes his book so valuable.
Hmm.
It's not just another partisan attack. It's a serious attempt to grapple with a complex issue and to offer solutions. It's fascinating to consider how these different pieces of the puzzle all fit together. The tribalism, the media landscape, the spread of misinformation. It paints a pretty bleak picture. But I'm curious, does Patterson offer any hope for systemic change? What about actual reforms that could address these issues at their root?
He does, and one area he really hones in on is campaign finance reform. He argues that the influence of money in politics has simply gotten out of hand, and that it's contributing to the rise of extremism and it making it harder for moderate voices to be heard, be competitive in elections.
Yeah, that makes sense. If politicians are constantly having to chase after big donations, they're going to cater to those with the deepest pockets, not necessarily the needs of everyday people.
Right. It's a valid concern. And Patterson explores a variety of ways to address it. He talks about things like stricter limits on campaign contributions, public financing of elections to level the playing field, and tighter regulations on lobbying to reduce the influence of special interests.
Okay, so these aren't exactly new ideas, but given everything we've talked about, the polarization, the gridlock, they seem more urgent than ever. Do you think there's a realistic chance of any of these reforms actually happening?
Well, like with any kind of systemic change, it's always an uphill battle. But Patterson does see some reasons for cautious optimism. He points out that there's a growing awareness of these issues and increasing public support for reforms. Plus, we can look to other countries that have successfully implemented similar changes to their electoral systems.
That's encouraging. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are models out there that have worked.
All right.
Are there any specific examples that come to mind?
Yeah, one that stands out is ranked choice voting. It's been gaining traction in various states and cities, and essentially it's a system where instead of just picking one candidate, you rank them in order of preference. And this can reduce the spoiler effect and encourage candidates to appeal to a broader range of voters.
It's like encouraging collaboration over competition, at least to some extent.
That's the idea. And Patterson also talks about proportional representation, which is used in many democracies around the world. In this system, instead of a winner-take-all system, parties get seats based on their share of the vote. So this can lead to more diverse representation and encourage coalition building.
So it's about finding ways to make our system more representative of the actual diversity of views and experiences in our country.
Exactly. And that's a key takeaway here, I think, from Patterson's book. He's not just pointing fingers or lamenting the problems. He's offering a vision for a more functional and more inclusive democracy.
It's call to action for all of us citizens, policymakers, journalists, to think critically about the systems we've created and to be willing to challenge the status quo.
And I think that's what makes this book so timely and so important. It's a wake-up call, but it's also a reminder that we have the power to shape a better future for our country and for our democracy.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into how America lost its mind. It's a sobering yet thought-provoking look at the challenges we face as a nation. But as Patterson reminds us, it's not too late to course correct. The future of our democracy depends on our willingness to engage in reasoned debate, to demand better from our media, and to hold our leaders accountable. So stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay hopeful. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.